So before you start pouring anything into the molds, as I mentioned before, you need to absolutely cover every surface of your mold. Here you can see the inside of the, see that's where the duck went. And you get the Vaseline and you absolutely cover every square millimeter of the inside of the mold. Now we're going to pour wax into this one, but the wax can still stick to plaster. So the Vaseline acts as a release mechanism. The other thing that you do is you actually cover the surface where the plaster meets the plaster, because what happens if you put a nice thick coating of Vaseline on there, it actually acts as a seal, kind of like a glue that holds the two halves together. And then when you clamp them, it makes it pretty well watertight. That's if you had made a good mold. And you remember, this is where the spout is. That's where you're going to pour the wax. And if you remember, we put these divots on here, same as in the mold itself. We put the divots on there. And that's so you can line up the two halves very well, and then they fit. Put it on very liberally, but at the same time smooth it out so that there's not a lot of ridges and things like that. The ridges won't prevent the mold from happening, but what will happen if you have too many ridges in there, whatever you pour in there, whether it's chocolate or whatever, it will actually have some of those lines in it. So if you need something very smooth where you get all the details, you make sure to get rid of all the ridges. And then you fit the two halves together where those divots are and the little tabs. And you have to, you can tie this together, you can strap it, or if you want to do it really the easy way, is you can just put a clamp on it. You clamp it really tight. And if you look carefully, you can see that the Vaseline is actually squeezed out of the crack around it. That's when you know you have a really good tight seal. And then this here was the skull. And also you do the same thing with the skull. You cover everything with Vaseline. And I'm going to pour plaster in here. So here you have to absolutely make sure that everything is covered. And then you can tie these pieces together. You can clamp them. There's any one of a number of ways that you can actually hold it together. If you're going to use wax as your medium to cast the duck in, you need to first melt the wax, and I would suggest that the best wax you can use is beeswax. It's not toxic when it melts, but you have to remember that you have to melt things very slowly. And so what we've got here is, it's kind of a tin can. It's inside a pot full of water, and the water prevents the wax from heating up too quickly, and it also prevents it from burning. So whenever you melt something on your stove, always melt it in a container that you then put into hot water. And once the water starts boiling, the wax will melt pretty quickly after that. So here you can see the wax almost melted. There's a couple little things floating around in there, but I think one of them's a dead fly. And it's sitting in the water. It's at a low boil. And that should be ready to pour probably in about 3 or 4 minutes. So here you can see the other mold. And it's got a nice big opening in it that we will pour the plaster. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it in a piece of cloth, and then I'm going to clamp it in another clamp to hold it tight. So here you see both of these are ready to pour. The duck goes in here, and so that has a smaller opening. And here I've actually wrapped the entire mold in cloth bound really tight, and now I've clamped it shut. It doesn't really matter what technique you use to hold this shut as long as it's held shut. And the reason I put the clamp here is because it sits nice and upright inside of this bowl. And here we have the bucket of wax. You can see the wax in there has been nicely melted. And it will stay hot for a little bit of time. And so once it's melted, you just very, very carefully pour it into the mold. Now, if you really want, you could use something like a funnel, or you just very carefully pour it in there. And you want to move it around a little bit like this, just to make sure it gets into all the little crevices in there. And you can kind of tap it. But the wax is still pretty hot, and I think it'll do a good job. There you go. And you still have a little bit of wax left over for a candle. And here you can kind of see a close-up of the actual wax in there. There's a close-up of the mold with the, there you can see the wax right in there. And you can see that the clamp has clamped it really tight, and there's little bits of Vaseline popping through. And you always pour it right up to the spout here, and then you can always break that spout off and reuse it. But you always want to make sure that you fill it up as well as you can. As the wax settles in a little bit, it may shrink to some degree. So if you have a little bit of extra wax left, then you can pour it back into the mold. There, just to top it up. So you'll probably need to let the wax rubber duck, or I guess it's now called a wax duck, you'd need to let it sit for about half an hour before it's cool enough to break apart. So the next thing we're going to do is to mix the plaster to put into the mold where the skull was. And here's the mold with the Halloween skull. And it's got a nice wide kind of aperture, so you'd be able to pour the plaster in there quite easily. So it's good to pour at least as much as you need, but in case you don't, you can always add a little bit of plaster on top. So remember that your ratio is 2 plaster to 1 water, and I figure I'm going to need two buckets of this plaster to fill up that mold. Maybe, maybe not. Remember, you put the water in first, and then your plaster. And always remember, you're going to make a mess. And as soon as you mix it, you want to pour it in there, because the closer you can get the plaster to being liquid, the better it's going to pour into all of the cracks. There we go. And remember, you got to mix it up so there's no lumps. Hey, Sue. Sue, do you think you could get me either a screwdriver or this one in the bucket there? I needed to tap the mold slightly. So, I almost have all the lumps out. And in just a minute, it'll be ready to pour. Now, it's going to settle a little bit. Some of it may leak through the seams. So you make sure you keep a little bit of spare plaster just to fill it up. Okay, it's pretty well lump-free. And like I say, as soon as you have it mixed properly, you pour it in there. And it looks like we measured exactly right. So one thing you can do is tap it a little bit. And then adjust this so it's really, really level. You might need to put something just slightly under there to level it out. and just tap it a little bit. Now you've got a little bit of plaster left here. And what you could do is you could just pour that plaster into a plastic bag. And then this, we don't have much. I actually measured it too well. But you could pour it in there. And we'll see what kind of form comes out of it. Okay, there you go. And remember, once again, absolutely no plaster in the sink. So we'll just let that little bit of plaster there harden. See what comes out of it. Okay, now I have taken the clamp off of here. And let's see what happens if we try to open it. Okay, good. It's cracked a little bit now. Oh, it's open. So now we can crack it open. It sticks a bit. Lovely. There we have our wax duck. Now the tricky part is actually getting it out. You want to proceed very carefully here so you don't break the duck. Sometimes you have to break the mold to get it out. Here we go. So there we have a wax duck. It's still in fact a little bit warm. And this was the plug that we had to take out. So there you get a nice close-up of the duck. There you can see the two nice little ducks sitting together. Now we'll have a look at how the mold of the skull came out. Remember, here was the beautiful original. So let's hope we got something that resembles that. So we unwrap the mold. And remember last time it broke. And I didn't actually glue it together. I wanted it to be able to come apart in parts. And the Vaseline actually held it together during the mold making process. So we'll just take off. And one of the reasons I actually didn't want to fix it was so that we could take the whole mold apart much easier. Now I'm only going to use this once, so I don't really mind if it breaks apart. There are some of the parts coming out. There we go, there's two of the parts, and here you can see the skull is kind of emerging. There's the beautiful skull. So I'm just going to get a hammer to actually gently pry these apart. And here we've got the hammer, and what you need to do is just kind of gently tap around the joint. So it's too bad it broke because it was actually quite a good mold, but I only wanted to make the one thing. So you've got a few little flanges here in the seam where the plaster leaked a little bit, but surprisingly little. Now this one you'd probably want to sand it and finish it up a bit, but here you can see the two skulls and the two ducks, and it looks like they're ready for Halloween. Oh, and there's one more thing here. We'll put the ducks there. Remember, we poured some plaster into a plastic bag. Sometimes I do that when I have extra, and sometimes the forms come out fairly interesting, and sometimes not. Here's like a little disc. It's got some nice organic form in it, things like that. But if you really want to do something interesting with pouring plaster in a plastic bag, just get a much bigger bag. This is just a little bit of extra that I had.